WED Enterprises, Glendale, California, Walt Disney's amusement park design firm, a creative playground for artists and engineers. All that came were directed, instructed, and mentored by Walt Disney himself, who considered the Imagineers to be his top artists. These included Herb Ryman, concept artist, Xavier Atencio, show writer, Yale Gracie, special effects, Claude Coates, show designer, Bob Gurr, ride designer, John Hench, designer and futurist, and the most recent recruit, George McGinnis, designer. While reviews of Walt within his animation studio were mixed, the Imagineers loved working for Uncle Walt. They knew to give each project their all. Walt instilled in them his philosophies of entertainment and storytelling. Walt did not want to create rides. He wanted to create experiences, stories that could be lived. Under Walt's eye, the Imagineers became a family, creating groundbreaking attractions and developing friendships among each other. But this group, in 1966, was just at the beginning of their journey. Their true test was on its way. In January of 1965, executives from the Monsanto Chemical Company traveled to Anaheim, California, to visit Disneyland Park. Among them was Monsanto's chairman, Dr. Charles Allen Thomas. The 64-year-old chemist had been working with Monsanto since 1936, and his claim to fame was his work on plutonium research for the Manhattan Project, which he conducted alongside Monsanto's Central Research Department. Thomas and his associates were traveling to Disneyland to view Monsanto's 3 exhibits in the park's Tomorrowland area: the Monsanto Hall of Chemistry, the Monsanto House of the Future, and the newest edition, Fashion and Fabrics Throughout the Ages. All 3 had been overseen by Thomas, who had worked closely with Walt since Disneyland's opening, resulting in a friendship between the two men. Thomas and the Monsanto team were fresh off of a trip to the 1964 World's Fair, at which they had seen the latest in attraction technology and speculative futures. With the fair fresh in their minds, Monsanto's Tomorrowland exhibits were looking more antiquated than ever. Thomas and his associates were not alone in their opinion. Walt Disney and his Imagineers had participated in the 1964 fair, creating 4 popular and groundbreaking attractions. After the fair, Walt turned his attention to the company's Florida project and his proposed City of Tomorrow, Epcot. But he also greenlit several other projects for his amusement design firm to complete, including a pirate-themed boat ride and a haunted house attraction. The largest of these post-fair projects was a complete refresh of Disneyland's Tomorrowland area. Outside of its 1959 expansion and a few other minor changes, the area had not evolved since its opening in 1955. Walt had never been satisfied with Tomorrowland. The rushed area was overly reliant on corporate sponsors, and some attractions had become noticeably outdated, while others were never futuristic to begin with. The Tomorrowland renovation would usher in a wave of new attractions that would engage in actual speculation of the future, with an emphasis of the transportation of tomorrow. Possibly Walt's greatest fascination, the entire new Tomorrowland project would be given the unique theme, World on the Move.
New ideas for Disneyland are first visualized in artists' renderings like this overall view of the new Tomorrowland area. The painting begins to take on form and dimension with construction of a scale model, detailing every attraction. This scale model represents more than 5 acres of new attractions in Tomorrowland.
The main avenue of Tomorrowland would be completely overhauled, with almost no inch untouched. The area's signature attraction, Rocket to the Moon, would be demolished and rebuilt with larger theaters. It would also be given a pre-show starring an animatronic named Mr. Tom Morrow. The attraction would be renamed to Flight to the Moon, and was set in a future in which, quote, travel to outer space will be an everyday adventure. The Circarama 360 film America the Beautiful would be replaced by the CircleVision 360 film America the Beautiful. The new film of the same name was shot with a new method, using 9 cameras as opposed to the original 11. The theater itself would also be expanded, taking up more of Tomorrowland's North exhibit building, closing the Art of Animation exhibit permanently. The rest of the show building, where the Art Corner exhibit once was, would be replaced by the Tomorrowland Terrace restaurant. The addition of the Tomorrowland Terrace would also result in the closure of the Yacht Bar. The Astrojet spinner would be replaced by the Rocket Jets, which would be elevated to rest on top of the loading platform for a brand new Tomorrowland attraction, the People Mover. The People Mover was a ride that gave guests a tour around Tomorrowland and through its attractions, with onboard audio describing the various sites. The People Mover was an evolution of the technology first used for the Ford Magic Skyway attraction at the 1964 New York World's Fair, and the ride was meant to act as a prototype to the transit system that would be integral to Walt's experimental community project. The People Mover would also travel to the front of the land, passing above guests' heads, in the area that the Clock of the World once was. Another attraction from the 1964 fair, the Carousel of Progress, would be relocated to Tomorrowland, taking the place previously held by the Space Bar restaurant. The new show building would have 2 stories, with the carousel show taking up the first floor and the second floor giving guests a view of Walt's experimental community concept in model form. The often unreliable Flying Saucers attraction would also be removed and replaced with a new Tomorrowland stage. What would become of the remaining Tomorrowland space was up to one sponsor, Monsanto. 2 out of 3 of Monsanto's attractions were located in the South Exhibit Building, alongside the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea exhibit. The other was the Monsanto House of the Future, which sat at the entrance to the land. Given that the House of the Future was now nearly a decade old, Monsanto and Disney decided to close the attraction, but not until after the rest of the new Tomorrowland project was complete. Monsanto would also close their other 2 exhibits, the Hall of Chemistry and Fashion and Fabrics Throughout the Ages, and Disney would remove the 20,000 Leagues exhibit, freeing up the entire building for a larger Monsanto attraction, a brand new ride, utilizing a familiar concept. For Monsanto's attraction, Disney would resurrect a concept that had been on the drawing board since the early days of Disneyland, a proposed Tomorrowland pavilion named Adventures in Science, or Science Land. This small area would have featured multiple new attractions, one of which was named Micro World. Micro World would have sent guests through a microscope, shrinking them down and allowing them to explore the inside of a drop of water. The attraction was given the nickname the Protozoa Ride among the Imagineers because of the protozoa-shaped vehicles in the initial 1957 concept art. Disney pitched the concept to Dr. Thomas and Monsanto, who liked the idea with one major note. Thomas wanted the molecule through which guests traveled to be a man-made polymer that Monsanto produced rather than a drop of water. The Imagineers pushed back on this idea. Water made much more sense, as it is one of the molecules most important to life and universally recognized among audiences. Thomas and Monsanto dropped the issue, and guests would end up traveling through water as opposed to a Monsanto creation. This would ultimately be the right decision, as the public's opinion on man-made chemicals was about to take a turn for the worse. Imagineers fleshed out the original Micro World concept. The new ride would still star water, but in a more visually interesting state, a snowflake. The ride vehicles would also no longer resemble protozoa. Instead, an entirely new ride system would be developed, thanks again to the 1964 New York World's Fair. The fair featured numerous attractions with unique ride systems, such as GM's Futurama, which featured a unique conveyor system that allowed guests to ride through visions of the future. Another ride, sponsored by Bell's System, featured an even more unique continuous system. Not only was this ride system efficient, but it allowed for dark rides to tell stories in new ways. Most dark rides up to this point placed guests in a vehicle with their view unrestricted, taking them along a curved rail, although always facing in the direction the vehicle was moving. However, the Bell System Pavilion had guests facing perpendicular to the direction in which they were traveling. These and other unique rides populated the fair and impressed crowds, including Dr. Thomas and his associates, who pressed Walt for an attraction that utilized moving vehicles, or at the very least, a moving sidewalk. Walt and his Imagineers had also been impressed with the unique ride systems of the fair, having contributed 2 themselves. Challenged with bringing a unique ride system to the Monsanto attraction, Imagineers considered multiple concepts, and it was at a meeting between 2 Imagineers that a novel idea was introduced. Imagineer Bob Gurr, who had created Disneyland's Autopia cars and contributed to the attractions for the 1964 fair, was in a brainstorming meeting with Imagineer John Hench, who had helped design the original Tomorrowland at Disneyland. Hench wondered if it was possible to place guests on a vehicle capable of rotating as it moved along the ride track, allowing guests to see in any direction or forcing them to focus only on certain parts of the ride. Gurr casually grabbed a toy from Hench's desk that resembled a candied apple. Gurr then turned the apple using his fingers, gripping the stick, asking Hench, quote, "Like this?" Hench responded, quote, "Yeah, like that." Gurr and Hench passed the concept along to Imagineers Roger E. Brogy and Burt Brundage, who got to work designing the ride system, which Gurr would dub the Omnimover. The Omnimover vehicles that would be used for the new Monsanto attraction would be referred to as the Atom Mobiles, and they would feature a large blue shell that would surround guests. Each shell would include a speaker that would place the ride's audio directly into the ears of riders. Most importantly, the shell prevented guests from viewing peripherally, forcing their sightlines so that they would only see what the Imagineers wanted them to. The Omnimover would be able to move 3,000 guests per hour throughout the attraction. Walt asked the team to make the system as smooth as possible, specifically so smooth that a martini glass could ride it without spilling. But in the end, each turn of the vehicle would be quite jerky. The ride system would not be the only innovative aspect of the Monsanto attraction. Another proposal from the original Microworld concept would be utilized. Imagineer Atencio, who would write the script for Pirates of the Caribbean, had an idea for, quote, a visual effect that will give the patrons the sensation of being reduced to the size of the atom. Atencio pitched the idea to Imagineer Herb Ryman, who illustrated the concept. Ryman and Atencio's initial concept showed a brass microscope with portholes, giving the illusion of guests getting progressively smaller. Some thought the design could be improved. The most recent hire at WED Enterprises was George McGinnis, an artist that was hired straight out of college after Walt, Hench, and Gurr had viewed his student project. One day, McGinnis was eating lunch in the WED cafeteria, sketching concepts of his own for the attraction's giant microscope on a napkin. Atencio looked over McGinnis's shoulder to see what he was working on. Liking what he saw, Atencio immediately took the napkin to the model shop to mock up the microscope. The mighty microscope, originally the magic microscope, would be the icon of the new Monsanto attraction, which was soon given the name Adventure Through Inner Space. Atencio was to write the script. Claude Coates, an Imagineer that had done extensive work on Disneyland and the World's Fair attractions, was set to design it. And Yale Gracie, a special effects artist that had worked on the Carousel Progress, would contribute illusions to the new ride. In August of 1966, Walt suggested placing a ceramic mural on Interspace's otherwise plain exterior. He pitched the idea to Thomas, who loved the concept. Walt assigned artist Mary Blair to the mural. Blair would end up creating two separate pieces, one for the Circle Vision show building and another on Interspace's show building. The murals would be named The Spirit of Creative Energies Among Children. Disneyland's Tomorrowland closed in September of 1966 for the renovation. Demolition of the old attractions began in October, but just 2 months later, on December 15, 1966, Walt Disney would die of lung cancer, leaving the world in mourning, and Walt Disney Productions and WED Enterprises in a state of shock. The future of many projects at WED, namely Walt's Florida project, were suddenly uncertain. However, the Tomorrowland renovation was never under question, as Walt had seen and approved the entire refurbishment before his passing. The Imagineers continued construction on New Tomorrowland and Adventure Through Inner Space as planned. Paul Frees, a voice actor known for his work in numerous science fiction films and for narrating Disneyland's Man in Space specials, was recruited to do a voiceover for the ride, reading the script written by Atencio. Atencio worked closely with Dr. Thomas and Monsanto, even traveling to Monsanto's headquarters and back to ensure the ride's scientific accuracy. Claude Coates' plans for the dark ride were unlike any ever created. The majority of the ride would be in pitch-black darkness, with only certain props and shapes illuminated throughout the journey, an experiment in minimalism. Coates' son, Alan, would later say, quote, "It was the psychedelic 60s after all, a real head trip," they used to say. This experience was exemplified by the ride's music, composed by musician Buddy Baker. In May of 1967, Baker conducted an orchestra, performing 47 different, unusual scores. Baker attempted to add a unique musical experience that would reflect the strangeness of the ride's story, with unexpected instruments that represented each part of the molecule. A more standard Disney song would also be featured in the ride, written by the famous songwriting duo, the Sherman Brothers. This theme was titled Miracles from Molecules.
Miracles from molecules around us everywhere. There are miracles from molecules in the earth, the sea, the air.
The attraction would take up 21,733 square feet of space, and the ride would be 6 minutes in length. New Tomorrowland debuted in phases throughout June and July of 1967, with the Carousel Progress, the People Mover, America the Beautiful, and the Rocket Jets all debuting. However, Adventure Through Inner Space remained under construction. It would not officially open until August 5, 1967. The wait was worth it, as Disneyland guests could now experience a journey unlike any other.
Tomorrowland is not just the realm of outer space. One of the most unusual new attractions is the Adventure Through Inner Space. These cars are called Atommobiles. Aboard them, Disneyland guests ride through a giant microscope.
Guests would enter the attraction by passing under its marquee, a large navy block. At the time, Disneyland used a ticket book system, in which guests needed to purchase a ticket to the main gate as well as a ticket to each ride they wanted to experience, with each attraction given a designation of A through E. However, as part of the Monsanto sponsorship, Adventure Through Inner Space was one of the few attractions at the park that required no ticket to ride, so any guest could experience Adventure Through Inner Space as many times as they wanted. Adventure Through Inner Space's queue and pre-show was one of the most elaborate created at the time. As guests entered the queue, they immediately saw McGinnis's mighty microscope. The microscope was a striking icon and, for many children, a convincing illusion, appearing to shrink the ride vehicles and guests right before their eyes. The microscope was aimed at a large petri dish. Inside, snowflakes danced, backlit by an illuminated pH scale. To the right of the microscope, a large rainbow target displayed the guest destination, the center of a snowflake. Pre-show narration, some of which was voiced by Atencio, depicted scientists making final preparations to send guests on their daring journey.
Phase blue. Light wavelength approximately 0.5,000 millimeters. Definition excellent.
Phase green. Resolving power decreasing.
Plaques lined the queue, spelling out the entire adventure to guests before they even boarded. As guests reached the end of the queue, they were greeted by cast members, dressed in costumes made of polyester, a material that Monsanto manufactured. Guests boarded a moving platform and took a seat in their Atomobiles to begin their adventure through inner space. The attraction began with guests entering the mighty microscope, shrinking in size just as they had seen previous guests do. In reality, the Atomobiles simply turned to the left. Through the ride's narration, Freeze played the voice of the first scientist to journey to inner space. At the beginning, this scientist could be heard calibrating the microscope to send guests into the snowflake.
Now your adventure through inner space has begun. Through the mighty microscope, you will travel into the incredible universe found within a tiny fragment of a snowflake.
During the rest of the ride, guests are only able to hear the suspended thought waves of the scientist preserved from his first journey.
I am the first person to make this fabulous journey. Suspended in the timelessness of inner space are the thought waves of my first impressions. They will be our only source of contact once you have passed beyond the limits of normal magnification.
As Freeze told guests of their journey, snowflakes, of significant size, danced around them, in effect achieved through projection. The vehicles continued to move, now rotating guests to face a large snowflake structure, confirming that they had now shrunk to the size of a snowflake. These enormous structures were enhanced through projections as well. But the journey was far from over. Guests continued to shrink, passing by walls of ice and entering a gorgeous scene of porous crystals. Atencio was a genius writer, and many of the lines delivered by Freeze are beautiful and haunting.
And still I continue to shrink. What compelling force draws me into this mysterious darkness?
Guests then shrank smaller and broke into inner space. Riders viewed molecules floating around them, represented by wire balls on string. Mirrors on the walls gave the illusion that there were many more molecules than there actually were. Guests then learned that they had shrunk even further, as they could now see H2O molecules almost as big as they were. Dancing electrons could also be viewed. The journey continued, as guests entered the oxygen atom, with light swirling to show that the electrons now surrounded the guests.
Electrons are dashing about me like so many fiery comets. Can I possibly survive?
Then the ride reached its climax, pushing guests straight toward the nucleus of the atom. The nucleus of the atom was represented by a flashing red light bulb. The narrator considers shrinking even smaller to explore it.
Do I dare explore the vastness of its inner space? No, I dare not go on. I must return to the realm of the molecule before I go on shrinking forever.
Guests then began their journey back, growing from the size of an atom to the size of a molecule. Projections reveal that the snowflake is melting.
Yes, the snowflake has melted, but there is no cause for alarm. You are back on visual and returning to your normal size.
As guests continued to grow in size, a large human eye peering at them through the other end of the microscope could be seen above their heads. After turning a final corner and returning back to their normal size, guests exited the microscope, disembarking from their vehicles, but not before passing a brilliant rain illusion called the Fountain of Fashion, showing off Monsanto products. As guests exited their Atomobiles, they entered a post-show dedicated to select Monsanto creations, depicted by elaborate and impressive animated posters and product displays. The carpets at the exit to inner space were made from Monsanto acrylion fibers and Cumuloft fibers. The post-show area also featured a unique global clock that displayed the time anywhere in the world, similar to the former entranceway icon of Tomorrowland. But this clock also showed all of Monsanto's facilities worldwide. Guests riding the People Mover, which passed through the show building, were given a unique perspective of the attraction's pre-show and post-show, as well as an exclusive view of a second-story mural. Guests flocked to the attraction, including some celebrities.
One of the early travelers through inner space was Prince Rainier of Monaco and his attractive children.
The ride thrilled audiences, but it also terrified them. Those young enough to buy into the illusion in the pre-show actually believed they were being shrunk down, unsure if they would ever grow back to their normal size. However, even kids and adults that knew the experience was fiction couldn't help but get chills from the pitch-black darkness and the echoing voice of Paul Frees. Teenagers were the least affected by the ride's atmosphere, but this did not keep them away. A few rowdy teenagers made it a challenge to grab and steal the hanging props throughout the ride, taking them home as souvenirs. Others made a game of trying to spit at the eye projection at the ride's end. This prompted Disneyland to be more strict in their envelope of protection, which exists to prevent guests from being able to reach and touch objects along a ride track. This also led to more CCTV cameras installed on rides to monitor guest behavior. But as much as teens took from the ride, they would also add to the ride's narrative with chemicals of their own: hormones. Adventure Through Inner Space became a favorite among teen parkgoers, hoping for some private time at the park. Not only was the ride dark, but the OmniMover ride system provided unique privacy, as guests were never facing one another, and even during the brief times in which they were adjacent, the large shell blocked much of the view. Adventure Through Inner Space would be added to the park's ticket system in 1972, designated as a C ticket. Rumors say that this is due to teens taking advantage of the free attraction, so requiring a ticket on the ride would discourage this behavior, or at the very least, Disney would profit from it. However, this did not work, and Disneyland operators reportedly sped up the attraction in order to shorten it, which seems more like a challenge than a solution. This strategy messed with the ride's effects and the pitch of the narration. At the time of Inner Space's debut in 1966, Monsanto was the 33rd largest company in America. Even more interesting is that they were only the 3rd largest chemical company in America. Monsanto was primarily focused on agriculture, but they had recently found success with Chemstrand, a subsidiary that was the largest manufacturer of synthetic fiber at the time. This venture meant that Monsanto not only created herbicides and pesticides for farming and the opposite of farming, but they also had a strong presence in the consumer product space, producing everything from carpets to rugs to clothes, as can be seen throughout Adventure Through Inner Space's post-show. This is one of the reasons that the company's relationship with Disney was so attractive, as Disneyland would end up being the company's primary way of presenting themselves to consumers and demystifying their work in the chemical field, convincing customers that Monsanto was not creating anything to be afraid of, just a few years before it was revealed that they were responsible for creating something that people should absolutely be afraid of. In 1968, the year after Adventure Through Inner Space opened, was a tumultuous year in the United States. From the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. to the assassination of Robert Kennedy, to the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, to the election of Richard Nixon, America was fractured and chaotic. At the forefront of Americans' minds was the Vietnam War, which was at its peak. Over 500,000 US troops were now in Vietnam, and the Tet Offensive, launched by the North, was reducing any hopes America had of winning the conflict. The given reason for America's involvement in the conflict was to spread democracy and stop the growth of communism. But this was becoming less convincing and accepted as more about the war was revealed. Anti-war protests broke out across the country, leading to a thriving counterculture movement that sought to bring peace to the world and tear down many existing social norms and restrictions. Not even Disneyland was exempt from the conflict. On August 6, 1970, around 300 members of the Youth International Party, or Yippies as they were popularly known, invaded Disneyland to protest the war. While an increasing number of Americans began to speak out against Vietnam, the conflict continued. Ground troops were constantly being outmaneuvered by the North, who were able to hide soldiers in Vietnam's dense forests. To combat this, the US initiated Operation Ranch Hand, in which US planes began spraying defoliants and herbicides over the forests of South Vietnam, in an attempt to remove the lucrative foliage cover and damage the food supply of the North. By 1968, this was a primary tactic utilized by the US Air Force, who used many different chemical agents, each named after the colored marking on their drums, such as Agent Blue, Agent White, and the most commonly used, Agent Orange. The main manufacturer of the chemicals, and the manufacturer who produced the most toxic of the formulas, was none other than the Monsanto Chemical Company.
Miracles from molecules around us everywhere. There are miracles from molecules in the earth, the sea, the air. Now men with dreams are furthering what nature first began, making modern miracles from molecules for man. Making modern miracles from molecules for man.
Tragically, the true effects of Agent Orange were not immediately realized, and Monsanto was rarely the target of counterculture protests in this period, with that honor going to the Dow Chemical Company, who also produced Agent Orange, but were targeted by protesters for producing the flammable gel napalm, which was also being used in Vietnam. This extended Monsanto's life in consumer products, and the company continued to turn to Disney as their major outlet of reaching the public. Also in 1968, Monsanto president and CEO Edward J. Bach announced that the chemical company would be one of the primary corporate partners of Walt Disney World's construction in Orlando, Florida. Operation Ranch Hand continued until 1971, when a government study linking the herbicides to birth defects was leaked to the press. After this, President Richard Nixon ended the program. Throughout the early 1970s, more reports began to emerge on the damage of the herbicides, with Monsanto's involvement revealed. Reports would worsen each year, and by the mid-1970s, as the US pulled its last troops out of Vietnam, the true effects of the herbicide could finally be seen. From 1961 to 1971, the US sprayed over 19 million gallons of defoliants in Vietnam. Agent Orange, which contained dioxins, a highly toxic class of carcinogens, resulted in unquantifiable suffering on the environment, Vietnamese people, and US troops. It is estimated that 400,000 people were either killed or critically injured as a result of the herbicidal warfare. As Monsanto made headlines for their involvement with the herbicides, Adventure Through Inner Space continued to entertain guests at Disneyland. At some point, the pre-show target effect was refurbished, with a sign explaining that the piece represents miniaturization control. The Fountain of Fashion would change to simply display rotating Monsanto signs. The post-show would eventually lose the world clock, and more product displays took its place. These were eventually removed, when the entire back wall was removed and traffic was redirected through the neighboring character shop, resulting in one of the first theme park gift shop exits. In 1977, Monsanto's 10-year contract for Adventure Through Inner Space was up for renewal. Despite the company's long-held relationship with Disney, the company declined to renew their sponsorship. Disney was certainly better off distancing themselves from Monsanto, whose public image was falling rapidly and would continue to decline. The same year that Monsanto declined to renew their Disneyland sponsorship, the company funneled millions of dollars into a new campaign aimed at convincing consumers that Monsanto's chemical products were good for them, despite the fact that they were alleged carcinogens. Monsanto was removed from the ride's narration, and their logos were removed throughout the attraction. The post-show was heavily altered, with the water effect being turned off, and the animated Monsanto posters replaced with attraction posters. The year after Monsanto declined to renew its sponsorship, the first of a series of class action lawsuits were filed by US veterans, attempting to hold Monsanto and other manufacturers responsible for the toxic and carcinogenic herbicides. 4 years after this, Dr. Charles Allen Thomas would pass away. His obituary lamented the public's newfound perception of big business as evil. This perception had worsened significantly throughout his lifetime. Many factors contributed to this decrease in institutional trust, but few, if any, are as significant as the Vietnam War, which fundamentally changed the way Americans thought and perceived themselves. Not only was trust in institutions down, but the post-war patriotism of the 1950s, that had in part led to the success of Disneyland, was more or less gone. A once optimistic America was suddenly cynical. Corporations that had once branded themselves as the shepherds of the future and had taken up residency in Disneyland's Tomorrowland were now in full damage control. And this was just the beginning. Despite the lack of sponsor, Adventure Through Inner Space continued to entertain throughout the 1980s, but its age was certainly showing. The snowflake effect in the queue was now broken. Many of the effects throughout the ride itself were either turned off or barely visible, and fewer guests were taking the voyage through inner space. Some complained that the cars were too cramped and that the speaker was too loud against their ear. Tony Baxter, an Imagineer who had risen the ranks to become the first prominent creative mind in the company's second generation of theme park designers, admitted to the press that Adventure Through Inner Space needed to be revised or eliminated, explaining that audiences don't respond to light shows and that the ride contained scientific inaccuracies. However, the company had no refurbishment or replacement plans in mind. That was until 1984, when newly appointed CEO Michael Eisner reached a deal with filmmaker George Lucas to create a new Star Wars-based attraction for Disneyland. While Imagineers were initially hesitant to place the fantasy attraction in the science-based land, they eventually agreed to a simulator concept named Star Tours, which was set to open in 1986. It was determined that the best location for Star Tours would be Inner Space's show building, meaning that after 18 years of operation, Adventure Through Inner Space would shrink its last guest. The final day of operation would be on September 2nd, 1985. Most of the ride was destroyed. The mighty microscope was torn apart, and all but a few Atomobiles were sent to a landfill in Mexico. Its closure would be a quiet one, but its legacy on Disneyland and the theme park industry was significant. One of Adventure Through Inner Space's biggest impacts on Disney parks would be its Omnimover ride system, a technology that would be used again for multiple attractions, most famously as the Doom Buggies in the Haunted Mansion. Adventure Through Inner Space was also Disney's first edutainment dark ride, and their most educational attraction at the time. Tributes to Inner Space could also be found in its successor. The ride's pre-show layout was retained for Star Tours, with the mighty microscope being replaced with a Starspeeder 3000 in the queue. This layout was retained when Star Tours was cloned for multiple other Disney parks throughout the world. The original Star Tours did not make use of Inner Space's post-show, and it became a storage area for the neighboring gift shop. This was until 1998, when it was replaced by extended queue space for Star Tours. One of the small Atomobiles from the mighty microscope could be found for a short time in the overhead conveyor system, and the mighty microscope could be spotted in Star Tours ride film. This Easter egg carried over into Star Tours' successor, Star Tours: The Adventures Continue, which also added another reference to Inner Space in a luggage scan gag in the queue. In 1998, a new Tomorrowland mural made reference to Inner Space, and that same year, the exhibit Innoventions opened with a parody of Inner Space in its phone booth.
Yes, your phone time is up, but there is no cause for alarm. You can deposit more.
These are just a few of the many references Disney has made to the defunct ride throughout the years. Adventure Through Inner Space was immediate proof that the Imagineers could create something spectacular even in the absence of their former leader. Whether it was Yale Gracie's illusions, Claude Coast's production design, or Atencio's writing, Walt had left his park and Weta Enterprises in great hands. However, Adventure Through Inner Space, as well as other attractions already in progress at the time of Walt's death, were mere trial runs for the challenge that was awaiting the Imagineers, as Walt had left them with more than just his philosophies and a few unfinished rides. He had left them with 27,000 acres of swampland in Florida and a dream called Epcot. And this is where Adventure Through Inner Space's true legacy would be seen, as the Imagineers continued developing the Florida project, opening the resort with the Magic Kingdom theme park in 1971. They were still deciding what to do with Walt's Epcot. It was eventually decided that instead of a city, WED would build a second theme park for the Florida resort, filled with edutainment attractions sponsored by major corporations, a permanent World's Fair dedicated to the idea of the future and optimism, to debut to a post-Vietnam, cynical America. This would be the Imagineers' greatest challenge yet. This was Epcot Center.